So thank you very much for staying with us for this, this discussion on hydrogen time to scale up. We have a couple of distinguished speakers with us. So Peter MacKEY from Air Liquide is the Chief Strategy Officer of the Air Liquide business line for hydrogen energy. And he's got an industry hat, but he used to be on the other side, a financial guy for the last 30 years. So he knows both worlds. And he's also having the hat of the co-chair of the study group of the Hydrogen Council, so he's going to give us a couple of updates on the scale-up dynamics today. We have then next to Peter, Louis-Aynard de Clermont-Tonnerre, who is heading the power industry and infrastructure group for Société Générale, and he has also a very good view of the equity market for the hydrogen energy schemes, and he worked a lot with also High24 in raising the fund we've raised. Also Romain TALAGRAND, who is heading the renewable practice for BNP, and has also, I think, taken the lead of another topic, which is the zero carbon task force of BNP. The hydrogen, but also the low carbon task force. Yeah. Within the low carbon task force. And we have then Christophe BARTHELEMY, who is a partner at the bureau CMS Francis Lefebvre, with 30 years of experience in the energy markets, but also in the administration and bar world, and was also working for EDF for General Council for a couple of years ago. So thank you for being with us. So we're going to cover this in three parts. The first one is what are the dynamics and the metrics of this scale-up that everybody speaks about? Is it real or not? Second, we're going to speak about the topics or the issues that may be hurdle to that. What are they, especially on the financing side? And then maybe we'll explore another topic, which is more a topic for debate, which is what's the role of hydrogen in that global energy landscape that needs to be revised completely with the current crisis? Is it a source of sovereignty, or is it a loss of sovereignty? Is it a need for imports, or is it something that Europe will be self-sufficient? It's a big topic. It's going to be a heated topic in the coming months and years. So without further delay, I would like to start with Peter. Maybe you can give us a couple of elements on the matrix or the dynamics of what people call the scale-up of the industry. Where do we stand?
Sure. Thanks very much, Pierre-Etienne. So with that, I'll answer with my Hydrogen Council hat on, I guess. And conveniently, the Council published, I think last week or the week before, its latest Hydrogen Insights report. So the purpose of that is to monitor what's going on in the industry, both in terms of projects that are being developed and announced, as well as what's actually in deployment today. And I think, I mean, there's no question that the incredible momentum we've seen in the last 18 months or so in the hydrogen space has really continued. I think in the first half of this year, the number of projects that we monitor has grown to close to 700. That's about 30% growth from the end of 2021. Representing announced investment of about $240 billion worldwide. So that's a 50% increase. So there's a huge amount of activity. The majority of that's actually in upstream in production, about 2/3. And that's split, I think, roughly today, and this is worldwide, 40% low carbon and 60% renewable. If I think geographically, Europe still has the largest number of projects, but the Americas are really catching up, and that's actually before the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So I think in North America and Latin America combined, the number of projects increased by 150% this year. And just to focus on the global renewable space, it's something like 175 gigawatts of electrolyzer projects have been announced so far.
But there are not any manufacturing lines for that.
Now, I think that's a fair concern, and one of the worries I think of the industry is getting the supply chains in place to respond to that. Now, the electrolyzer manufacturers on their own plan, the electrolyzer stack manufacturers, their own plans are reasonably well aligned actually with that 175 gigawatts. So we see installed stack manufacturing capacity of about 3.5 gigawatts this year. And that's growing to, I think, around about 45 gigawatts of stack manufacturing capacity by 2025. So if that rolls out, then the electrolyzer manufacturing should be able to keep up with that deployment. The question then is all of the supply chain before those manufacturers, so whether it's the precious metals or membrane materials and things like that.
And when we look at the dynamic, it started, I would say, a little bit after the Fit for 55 European plan, and it's grown, but we don't know yet how much has converted into real projects. So what's your view on that?
Not enough, but nowhere near enough. So the number of announced projects is still a long way away from being close to a net zero trajectory by 2030. And of those announced projects, less than 10% of them are either at the point of decision, or the decision has been made, or in construction, or in production today. So the real challenge is actually how do we get those announcements into investment decisions and steel on the ground.
But on the other side, if I turn to you, Louis-Aynard, you see a lot of successful equity raised in the equity market, and proving that there is a dynamic behind it and that people are ready to put money behind those players.
Yes, Pierre-Etienne. Sorry. Hello. Yeah, we do see a lot of equity raise on the equity side. Clearly, going back on your project, you're listing 700 projects. We do track also on a global basis, in fact, the number of projects. We're not at 700, we are much lower than that, but obviously what we see is two types of projects. We see projects coming from more local output, local usage, being developed either by big corporate sponsors or emerging developers of hydrogen projects. And these guys focus on the electrolysis brick. They will need to focus on securing the electricity, the renewable electricity from local renewable developers, long-term PPA. And then they have the offtake. That's one side of the equation. And then we see the large gigascale projects that are being developed more in countries where you've got abundant and maybe cost competitive, in fact, electron. These are obviously much bigger projects, will require, in fact, not only electrolysis investment, but also renewable, port infrastructure, you name it. And these will be done by tranches and will be more going through the latest part of the decade there. So quite interesting to see, in fact, the typology of both projects. On your question, Pierre-Etienne, yes, we see plenty of equity. That's what keeps us, in fact, very busy these days. Not only trying to raise funds like I-24, but also raising funds for projects from large corporate sponsors or from these new emerging developers who are looking to raise equity to fund the DevEx, but also the equity into the projects that they're developing. And they select either to go IPO or they go private route there.
And when you look at the geographies, do you see, it used to be mostly Europe, then it went into the Southern Hemisphere projects, very large power-to-X projects. And where is it now? With the US moving up, is it more balanced in terms of project developments? Do you see also the Asian coming, especially Korea and Japan? Both of you, and then maybe Romain, you can add something.
I think we're seeing a lot of the big giga projects that Louis-Aynard referred to developing. I mean, the half of that electrolyzer deployment is in 3 countries: Australia, Chile, and the US. So Australia and Chile in particular are very much focused on the big export opportunities.
Clearly, Europe has been quite active on the emergence of new developers. But it's true that, in fact, we also concur on the geographies. I have to say that Asia, we're seeing also coming from the north of Asia, some projects popping up there.
But for imports?
Mainly import project there.
Romain, do you see the same trend from your side?
Yeah, the trends we observe. The trends we observe are very, very similar. I think most of the action we're seeing is on the procurement side or the technology side, where there's a need for equity, not necessarily huge amounts for the moment. And indeed, it's been quite successful in raising equity for, electrolyzer companies or developers. When I look at the production of hydrogen itself, there are clearly two segments in the market. There's, projects that are closer to production, to demand, for instance, in Europe. Those projects tend to be relatively small, relatively experimental, because the renewable resource it can be a challenge for different reasons, and we can talk about it, with some exceptions like, the Nordics or the south of Spain. What is increasingly keeping us busy is the large-scale production projects far away from Europe in the geographies that were mentioned. I think it's fair to say, with a few exceptions, a lot of those projects are still at relatively early development stage, so they need to, progress on securing land, procurement of electrolyzer, which is a challenge, which would probably require some form of partnership so that, both legs of the industry can work in a synchronized fashion. So that's the core of the action we see, raising equity for developers and early stage project structuring for the mega production projects.
But Peter, there's no technology hurdles to develop those very large power-to-X projects in very remote places. Are we confident we can easily transform that into hydrogen, transport hydrogen, or transport? How does it work? Maybe it's not clear for everyone.
There are many potential. I don't know if this is coming on. There are. I know. I mean, anybody that knows me means I don't really need a microphone, but I have a loud enough voice. But I mean, there are many routes. The cheapest way to move a hydrogen molecule around is by pipeline. That's the cheapest and easiest, but obviously it requires an awful lot of coordination and along the route. It depends, I think, whether you're trying to move an electron around or hydrogen around or a finished product around. So countries that are short of power are looking for an energy vector that they can put into their power generation system. So whether that the solution or the energy vector of choice at the moment appears to be ammonia, and I think the majority of projects that are firmed up in terms of the energy vector they're using are looking at ammonia. You then have a question about moving a hydrogen molecule around, and one way of doing that is in the form of liquid hydrogen. It's very technical. It's not the easiest product to handle at minus 253 degrees centigrade. But there are projects developing looking at that. In particular, the JSE project in Japan is the Japanese government has put a significant amount of funding in to investigate the development of liquid hydrogen supply chains. And then there's the question about what end products you can move where there are large renewable resources. So topics that are coming up at the moment are things like methanol, e-methanol for the maritime industry, or sustainable aviation fuels for the aviation industry. And then there's also a lot of discussion about splitting the steel supply chains, for instance. So actually producing DRI, so the first stage of steel processing, and relocating that back to those areas where you have both the iron ore and renewable resources, and shipping DRI to finish off in the destination markets.
That's going to lead us to the last part of the discussion, so we will stop there. Maybe just to wrap up, you should not believe that it's too much, because if I understand well, the IEA agenda for 2030, integrating the role of hydrogen as one of the key energy vectors for tomorrow, would require 790 billion of investments, and the total of announced projects today barely raises 200. So, but what has been already decided is only 20. So we have a small issue between what's needed, what's announced, and what's real. And so that's a little bit the topic we need to move to now, which is the second part of our discussion, which is what's missing to make those numbers converge better. Maybe we're not going to invest 700 billion in the decade, but at least if we were to really invest a couple of 100 billion, we would be on the right trajectory with the climate agenda. So what's missing to make those projects happen? Maybe to start, Christophe, you've got a background from other large waves of significant disruptive investments taking place, like the renewable industry over the last 20 years. What was there that is probably not yet completely there for hydrogen in terms of maybe regulations or financial schemes that were there to support? Maybe you can say a couple of words on that.
Okay, thank you. What is very interesting to me when I read the pre-notification made by France to the European Commission in February of this year is that it is not only about public tenders and 15 years contract, but also about direct industrial use, which is very specific to hydrogen, obviously, and an annual review of the amounts compared to the IRR of the project, which is absolutely new to me in this kind of state aid scheme. Now, based upon my experience of photovoltaic wind farm, offshore wind farms since 10 years, clearly when you decide to set up an industrial sector with this type of tool, it works. Offshore wind farms have developed, I mean the public tenders are developing in France a real industrial sector. So when you put money and you have a strong political will, I believe it works. Now, the problem of this, to me, is first the instability of the rules, going up to retroactivity regarding photovoltaic and even offshore wind farm with the law of August 2018, which is extremely disturbing for the financing and for the development of this project. The duration of the contract, which is probably too long if you consider the technological breakthrough and the fact that all these entities are out of the market, even with CFDs, during all the duration of this contract. And third, it makes very difficult the assessment of the amount of state aid, because you cannot estimate the evolution of the cost of this industry during such a long duration. So to me, the current mechanism is probably outdated due to the pace of technological breakthrough. And maybe this will also impact the development of hydrogen.
So does it mean that when we look back at the renewable industry, if I remember well, the best projects, and it's rather counterintuitive, were the first one, because the feed-in tariffs and the financing conditions were better, even though the technology, competitiveness, the levelized cost of ownership was far higher than what it is now. It was basically 20 times higher. But still, the best returns were done at that time. But what you're assuming with what you just said, and what we all have as a fear, is that if you move too early into those large projects, you may invest into electrolyzers which are not the best in class, higher capex, and then you're left with stranded assets in 5-6 years. So how did the renewable industry maneuver with that? And are there any solutions to help that in terms of policies? Any clues from you? And Romain, you may bounce back on that as well.
Yeah, I think we need to keep in mind that it was much easier for renewables because you already had a transmission network, you already had a demand for electricity. You may not have demand for hydrogen today. And so the extra cost of renewables was, at least initially, relatively marginal. And today it's not an extra cost, it's a big windfall income under the CFDs. I think the other thing to keep in mind, which is a bit difficult when doing CFDs for hydrogen, I think, is the volume required is such, and as you said, you know, in the net zero scenarios, in the 1.5 degree scenario, or even in some, you know, less positive scenarios with higher temperature, you need such huge volumes that the cost, the cumulative cost under your CFD may be very high. So I think we need to see this as an instrument to, you know, kickstart the market for perhaps relatively small volumes, and hopefully the industry can bring down the cost relatively quickly or more quickly, because that's going to be a concern. And as you say, we're even struggling to figure out what the cumulative cost is.
On the other side, the effort to be done in terms of cost of ownership is not the same. For the renewable industry, it had to be divided by 20 over the last 20 years, while for hydrogen, we need to divide by 2. So it's not exactly the same level of magnitude that needs to be achieved. Still, Air Liquide, you have a big both strategy goal, but also some pressure to shift some of your existing grey hydrogen suppliers to green. How do they accept to pay the price for it?
Well,
without any confidential
you
information,
you already mentioned you know, the impact of RED II, RED III. I mean, the focus on introducing a renewable requirement. I suspect we'll probably come on to touch on Repower EU in you know, shortly, but you know, laying out expectation of conversion of grey to renewable is one aspect. So the key thing really is to create demand, and so it is actually to, you know, to put structured policies in place to help the downstream markets create demand for the whole of the supply chain to begin to develop and to satisfy that requirement. Obviously, many of our customers as well have their own climate ambitions. So, you know, we share an awful lot of our intentions, and I think people recognise that there is a cost implication to that. We have to recognise that in decarbonising our industry, that you know, we're internalising what has been until recently an external cost. So there's no way about it. I mean, if hydrogen were the cheaper solution, we'd have a hydrogen economy today.
And clearly, to answer your question there, if you want that whole sector to scale up there, it goes back to the bankability of this project. You cannot be financing all these projects 100% equity, and that goes back to pairing with the equity, with public support that will be needed on subsidies, especially for these early projects. You need private debt. And yeah, I think that's where we see the activity right now is more, we're doing feasibility of bankability surveys there for all these projects that you were mentioning. You know, at the end of the day, in all these bankability, you see many risks being assessed, technology, regulatory, completion, you name it, and then there's offtake. And that goes back to the condition of your customers, in fact, to offtake your output, being it volume, price, duration, you name it. So without offtake, long-term offtake, you're not going to get long-term financing, and therefore that's going to be a big limit, because clearly, while we could see the smaller scale project being all funded equity, when you move to these giga scale projects, the need for debt will be necessary. That's very similar to hydrogen, to renewable, to LNG way back when.
But what's new is that offtake are only coming through a regulatory or compulsory rule. So I don't know, Christophe, if there is any past situation where a regulation has forced offtake to shift to a certain kind of product, because this is exactly what we're doing now. Because of the climate agenda, we're shifting the need of industrial customers to use classical fuels for their processes to low carbon fuels. Is there any past regulation like that that has worked on the same scale? I think it's rather new.
Well, with a different mechanism, which is a prohibition, like for coal, for example. You exclude coal by a standard that makes coal power plants unable to comply with a standard. So yes, you have some elements, but which are pretty different.
But here, it's probably the only way to make indeed offtake grow, because without offtake, I don't see if you find any way to do project financing. Let me know. I'm interested.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the project finance market financed some grey ammonia projects 20 years ago without fixed price offtake. So without going into the details, it's not necessarily entirely black or white, right? Fixed price, long-term offtake, take or pay, and fully exposed to market risk. I think there's some degree of risk sharing that can be structured between production projects and off-takers. I think that there's a number of other elements we need to look at. I think one challenge for off-takers also is regulatory risk. If I commit to an off-take, I want to make sure that this green hydrogen or green ammonia is going to be considered green for the duration of my off-take. And equally, the investors into the project, be they debt or equity, they will want the same kind of certainty, right? So I think there's a need for acceleration there. The other big obstacle, obviously, is cost, and you were alluding to it. Should I be waiting for cheaper hydrogen? I think one answer to that is also probably to develop those mega projects in phases. So that they can benefit from cheaper electrolyzers later down in the future. In any event, they may not be able to procure the full electrolyzer capacity from day one. There's going to be plenty of constraints. Another element is also the behavior of customers. In a way, we've seen the importance for electricity consumers to demonstrate, industrial consumers to demonstrate that their green electricity was becoming greener over time. So hopefully that's also an element that helps, crossing the line.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up. I mean, the question of cost obviously is a critical one. But Pierre-Etienne, you talked about how much renewables had to bring their cost down relative to electrolysis. Yes, we as electrolyzer project developers and our partners need to work on bringing electrolyzer costs down. But let's not forget that 50 to 70% of the renewable hydrogen cost is renewable power. And so we need access to enough renewable power, while at the same time we're also looking at electrifying the industry and increasing the renewable penetration of the grids that we have.
So are you happy with the recent decision of the Parliament to say to the Commission they were not anymore entitled to develop the regulations for the delegated act and killing the additionality principle? So maybe, I don't know, anyone wants to explain that for the audience? Christophe, you want, or Peter? Or, so, do you want me to do it?
Do I get it?
Please, go ahead.
So
that's a fundamental topic, sorry to...
So it's essentially, additionality is about, as I understand it, which is, I should be careful how I explain it, but if you build a new renewable hydrogen production facility, then you need to show that it is associated with new incremental renewable power production that is not subsidized.
We want to avoid that what happens with the German taxpayers having a battery car fueled on coal happens for hydrogen.
Yeah, and I think the challenge in having additionality associated only with the hydrogen industry was that it's making it's putting a particular hurdle on renewable hydrogen production that it's not putting on other parts of the economy. And so, whether every new use of electricity should be associated with renewable power. That would be, with new renewable power, would be a sort of a fairer way of approaching it. Or the other way to say, to approach it, is to put expectations on the grid operators and to look at the residual mix that is available on the system.
The only problem is that if we look at what's needed in terms of renewable power in Europe to feed the REPowerEU recent accelerated plan to move to hydrogen, it would hit basically 50% of the offshore wind in the future, 30% of the onshore wind, and maybe 20% of the solar, so which is a lot. So that calls for the third part of the debate, which is how hydrogen helps or not energy independence in Europe, and what can we do about it, and what's the right mix between importing or producing locally hydrogen.
Are you asking how many gigascale hydrogen projects we will have in Europe there?
That's one of the topics. So how do you see the situation? We have an issue, which is that because of the Ukrainian war, we need to accelerate the shift out of fossil-based energy, so gas and oil. There are four major levers that have been announced by the REPowerEU plan. I guess you know them. One is to work on our own heating and consumption and to be more sober. And the other one is to increase biomethane production, which is going to be just a small part. The third one, the most obvious, is of course to increase the diversity of source of imports with LNG, with an issue which is to build floating energies and maybe not too hard LNG terminals, because then we're back into another 30 years of LNG dependency. And the fourth one is to increase the share of energy you source in the form of hydrogen, importing 10 million and producing 10 million. But that then triggers a big question of if you shift imports of gas to imports of hydrogen, what happens with Europe's sovereignty? Is it good or is it bad? So I would like to launch the question to
I mean, maybe the starting point is we're seeing the constraints in rolling out enough renewable energy in Europe to decarbonize power. Then we know that a lot of processes are going to be electrified, so you need even more renewables. And then potentially, if you want to produce those 10 or 20 million tons, you need a huge extra amount of renewables because of the efficiency of the electrolysis process. And the question is there enough space, enough land at the right pace? And the answer, if you look back, is most certainly not, I guess. So I think, and there's also, I guess, a matter of competitiveness of electricity in Europe. You need, as you were saying, Peter, you need very cheap electricity. That's the main driver of the cost competitiveness of hydrogen. And you're in a continent where, facing an energy crisis where electricity prices went through the roof. So is it where you're going to get the cheap electricity? Maybe in certain places, but not at a very large scale, in my opinion. So you probably don't have much of a choice but to look at imports. I think independence is, and by nature, because there's not enough energy, there's not enough renewable energy on the continent versus the demand. And so independence then is all about diversification, I suppose. So it's not, it's reducing dependence on certain names. And that gives you the option, because there are a lot of the countries are not oil and gas production countries.
And also, I think the dynamic, I don't know how you see that in your projects on the industry side, but permitting for large-scale renewable is still rather long, 4 to 8 years. There are a lot of proposals in France and in other countries to try to boost that timing, to reduce it at the cost of biodiversity, of cutting short of a couple of other requirements that society wants to be dealing properly with environment. But if you compare that to doing a very large project in Oman or in Australia, in the middle of nowhere, close to the shore, where there's basically no one, nobody, and not much of living species, then the permitting is far lower, the scale is far larger, and the cost is far better. So the question is, what should we do? Should we continue to try to develop everything in Europe for the sake of sovereignty, or do we consider that because it's very diverse, you've got many places where you have that kind of access to cheap energy, by importing cheap energy you might save your heavy energy intensive industries in Europe? While if you don't do that, you might have this energy intensive industry shift there instead, like the HBI industry, the DRI industry, the fertilizer industry. That's probably one of the key topics we're going to see in the next couple of years. And the question is, what do we do there? And I don't know if you have any comments on this.
Maybe just to go back on the 10 million ton that will be locally produced, I found that amount absolutely outstanding from a size standpoint. That requires hundreds of renewable capacity being developed there. Then the question is, where do we, going back to Romain's point there, where do we build them? Is it offshore? Is it nuclear? But that's already quite a big amount on the face of it. And I think that's where nuclear goes back into the taxonomy, additionality, or the point and saying, is it really the way to be able to produce large-scale hydrogen there? Because we will need access to abundant and cheap renewable electricity there. And that's really the question for Europe as a whole there. Clearly, we see some project in Spain there where there will be more onshore being developed and trying to be competitive, both in terms of quantity, but also in terms of price. But that's a challenge there.
Maybe a word, 2 words about that. First point, as you know, in France, 66% of the energy made by nuclear plants is turned into steam and just lost in the air, in the rivers, or in the sea. So we have more than 60 gigawatts of capacity that can be used. When we have 40 gigawatts of offshore wind farms, altogether, nuclear and offshore wind farm, you will have 100 gigawatts that can be used. So we have some resources, not only the ones you mentioned. And second, the more you connect the consumers, the more networks you have in Europe, the less imports you need. And so we have a stake about this infrastructure that is to be built. And this is a huge stake in the discussion at the moment around the fourth gas package. And on this point, I would just mention a point. When I think about hydrogen, it seems to me that we are in a situation which is pretty similar to the situation that we had at the beginning of the 20th century when we began to build electricity and coal gas networks around the cities. And then during the 20s, 30s, we connected all that and we created a meshed network all over Europe. But at the beginning, we had a mechanism which was local and very decentralized. And now, from the regulatory point of view, we are using tools that we developed for renewable at the beginning of the 21st century, which are tools used in a situation where you had already the networks, amortized networks, and you have an overcapacity of production. So maybe the regulatory tools are not adapted or totally adapted to the situation we are facing regarding hydrogen, especially if we want to do that very quickly.
But do you have a suggestion then?
No, my suggestion is not to be ideologically blocked on mechanisms that exist and that have been designed for a situation very different, and to be very flexible and pragmatic, like the US are or like the British are. I believe we should really change our mind and focus on the needs, on the emergency, and on the pace we want to reach, and not on the tools. And unfortunately, at EU level, we always begin by the tools and by the regulation and by the rules and so on. Maybe we should switch and come to a more industrial point of view at the beginning of the reasoning, and we should probably change a lot of tools that we are using intellectually.
But we're also dealing with a complete systemic shift. we are replacing an existing system which is fossil-based by another one which needs to be low-carbon-based. So without bringing any individual benefits to everyone, unless it's collective. Because if everyone doesn't take it, then we don't shift, the thing does not get low carbon, and we don't benefit from the impact on climate. So this is very different from any infrastructure play that has happened over the last century, where any new infrastructure like the telecom, the electricity, the transport, were bringing an additional individual benefit to each and every one. So everybody was ready to pay for it. Well, here, only the society can pay collectively. This is what makes it a little bit more difficult than usual. That's why it's more interesting, maybe also. But should we, because we're running to the end, you want to add something, and then maybe we'll ask if there is one or two questions from the audience, and then we'll make conclusions.
No, I was going to say when you mentioned industrial policy or looking at this from an industrial angle, I thought it was perhaps more than the CFD for importing hydrogen. I thought it made a lot of sense to provide grants, which is what the EU has done, provide grants to the technology part. That's also an element of preserving your independence and preserving your industry. And in the same spirit, I think probably also more thoughts to be given to facilitating the import infrastructure.
H2 Global, for example.
Yeah, I mean they're providing a CFD, but they're not building the ammonia conversion terminals. Doing these things, or the pipelines.
And we also need certification to be able to do that. I mean, one of the most critical things for global trade to develop is to recognise how you determine the characteristics of a hydrogen molecule.
So I guess it was a very simple discussion. So with certification to finish it, which is not a simple topic in itself. So any questions from the audience? No, it was clear. So, no, there is one question. Happy to take it, please.
Thank you. That way I won't shout. Sorry for the people close to me when I shouted. My question is twofold. The first is, well, actually both of them are really regarding the bankability of hydrogen projects. The first relates to securing long-term revenues. Is there any form today of agreements that are in somewhat similar to offtake agreements that exist for renewable energy? And the second question, again, very much related, is there today, do you see any sort of preference, either from direct purchasers or from regulators, towards liquid hydrogen versus ammonia or any other form, really?
So, Peter, you're from an incumbent industrial players who know what is over-the-fence supply of hydrogen, so you might have to say on that.
Yeah, so our large industry customers, and the majority of that in the for industrial hydrogen that's supplied today goes to desulfurization of fuels in refining. So, and those customers typically sign long-term 15-plus year contracts with associated investments, and then obviously all of the various requirements in terms of specifications and reliability and backup and so on. I think that the way those industrial customers already have the mindset to be able to think about that long-term commitment, and so to the extent that the requirement is placed upon them to change, so through Renewable Energy Directive, and the financial subsidy position support systems are in place to help to balance that cost. I think that type of project can and is developing, but the challenge is where I mean, that's 90 million tons today, but we're talking, many estimates are sort of 600-700 million tons of demand by 2050. So there's an awful lot of new applications that need to be convinced to use hydrogen in the first place before thinking about adopting existing supply chains. In terms of preference, yeah, sorry.
Maybe Romain, you have a say on the preference?
No. I think we expect a variety of end users to be considering to sign contracts. I think when you look at industries, not all industries are in the same position. You know, the cost impact is not the same. The readiness to switch to hydrogen is not the same. Obviously, those industries that I'm stating the obvious, but who are, you know, switching, just need to switch from grey to green is going to be the starting point, I suppose. We've done in certain in certain areas, we've done some cost comparisons between a sort of an optimal hydrogen project and a fossil fuel project, or cost for the user, and we've seen in some situations, you know, pricing cost differentials that were not truly significant. So that's probably where it's going to start, I would think.
Okay, so thank you. I think we need to conclude with that. So any last word on conclusion on your side?
Maybe on my side, just going back on financing bankability, the good news here is that banks like Société Générale are getting ready internally, in fact, to assess the bankability of this project with all the risk associated. And I think things will accelerate into 23, 24, 25 there. So clearly here, this is getting ready internally, and I think that's very important from the financing supply chain. Next to the equity that we just mentioned is there and willing to be deployed in commercially viable project there.
From the industrial, I'm sure it will be on shortly. From the industrial perspective, I would say that you know, availability of renewables, how do we get that, and how do we, you know, what policies are developed to really begin to crystallize demand, which creates offtake and therefore bankability. And at the heart of both of those really is simplifying and speeding up the policy decision-making process.
Yeah, and maybe just to add on the bankability and financing, I think we can also. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Peter. I think. The other thing to keep in mind is, you know, the renewable financing asset, the renewable asset class is super liquid. There is a lot of money because banks and investors have their own decarbonization commitments, and you know, all the markets have repriced this year, but the renewable industry much less than others. So I think there's, you know, we expect this to become a liquid market when we've solved the issues we discussed.
Yes, just one word. We are facing several emergencies. So in this situation, please use regulation and law as a tool and not as a constraint.
Thank you. I think to conclude also, no misconception. With the European IPCEI recent announcements plus the IRA on the other side, the race is on. The question is not whether it comes, see who is going to be the fastest. You will have projects everywhere, and the question is who's going to win the race. So I wish you with that a good end of day, and thank you for the time.